All right, folks, I think we're ready to get started. Welcome to Management Deals with Real Estate Developers. This is one of the most exciting webinars I think that we have hosted so far, based solely on the fact of the luminaries that we have as our guests. Keith Durst on the top of your screen, Peterson on the bottom. I'll tell you a little bit about both of them. Keith, first of all, Keith, you ran and owned a Michelin-starred restaurant in the city, a Terra. What years did you do that?
You know, I kind of forgot what years. It was when it first opened. So we, we partnered and kind of built that out. It was early. I'm thinking it was 2010 to 2012 where I was involved in a Terra, maybe, and around that, it went from a Terra to Aska. So I had a Terra and then Aska in Brooklyn. And it was like two and a half years with each of those groups. Yeah,
just some fantastic restaurants. And now you own a consulting company called FOC, friend of the chef, and worked with real estate companies like Tishman. You've done Rock Center. You're like Mr. Rock Center, right? You put that whole thing together. You've done the Lincoln Center deal with Kwame, right?
That's an interesting one because it's a bunch of consultants, yeah.
Hudson Yards, on and on. So you really have bridged the gap between real estate and restaurants, and you've done so many deals, and it's going to be very exciting to hear your perspective on management deals. And this is Peterson, Peterson. He's a West Coast guy. He's an East Coast guy.
Yeah.
Worked with Related for 20 million years, 25 years or something like that.
At least.
So when he worked for Related, he was in charge of all the strategic planning for their F&B concepts. Worked with Thomas Keller. You've worked with, and you work with frequently Jose Andres.
Mm-hmm.
What else can I say about you?
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting. I kind of started more on the landlord side and that for about 12 years, and then kind of flipped over to still working with some landlords, but doing a lot more chef work. So kind of, I try to think I can wear both hats and kind of sit on both sides of the table. So.
Yeah, and you do. So let's talk about management agreements. We're going to put up a little PowerPoint. Not that I need it, but because I don't know, I guess I'm used to running webinars with PowerPoint. So Alex, you want to put up our PowerPoint to take us through this? Thank you. So let's flip to the next one. This is a legal disclaimer. This means that anything you hear today is not legal advice. Next. Okay, let's get into this. We got an hour. Again, folks, you can feel free to chat us up in the chat box. I'll answer whatever questions I can. I'm going to call on you guys randomly. Sometimes we'll just have a free-for-all. But Peter, why don't you start us off? When we hear of development deals and who developers are, what does that even mean? Who is a developer? What kinds of developers are there out there?
Yeah, I think I would kind of say it was developers / property owners. I'd kind of add a little bit to that. And it's interesting, right? You can have the big boys that like we talked about, a Related or a Tishman, Aspire, something like that tend to be doing really large, well-financed projects in multiple markets. And then you can have some smaller mom and pop type firms, right, that can still do some really quality developments, but they're just wired a little bit differently, right? They don't have the big corporate structure of some of the bigger developers. Some of the developers, right, operate across all different asset classes, right? They like to diversify their portfolios. So they're operating in office and residential and hotel. And then you have some that are very specialized and just operate in one asset class. So some that you're dealing with may just do hotels. And it's kind of good to understand that differentiation, because if you really are looking to stay in one asset class, right, then ideally you want to kind of chase after some groups that are playing in that space.
And so, Keith, here in New York, when Peter talks about asset classes, where are the deals getting done? Are they getting done in hotel developments? Are they getting done with cultural centers? What are you seeing here in New York? So we know what to target if we want to get ourselves a deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I think right now we're seeing deals getting done in all asset classes in New York and some of the larger cities around the country. Definitely cultural centers. We're really focused on, what we've done at Lincoln Center, and Lincoln Center's got more coming with another building and some other changes. The Whitney, the Brooklyn Museum, a couple of others. The Met's going to be going through some changes too now. But for sure, office buildings, hotels, and even some mixed use resi / hotel kind of plans as well, and product. And I think what we're seeing is anytime you have an asset class that's in need of a little bit of help, where obviously office is right now, but so is hotel and the cities, and as they're changing, there's an immediate need for an improvement of the product as a whole. And the first thing you can do with that make the biggest impact is food and beverage. So we're seeing number one with that. Cultural centers and museums and places like that are just understanding that they've just had a miss going for the past 10 or 15 years, not actually capturing.
Okay. All right. So we got cultural centers, we got offices, we got hotels. What am I missing?
Probably some resi towers too.
Residential towers. Okay. Anything else? All right. So those are management deals. So now we understand different forms they come in. Who are the major players now in New York, Keith? Can you just rattle off like a couple of the major players that everybody should know about?
Yeah, well, I mean, Tishman's been known for what they've done at Rock Center, and they have other product. Blackstone is a player all the time. They don't have a tremendous amount of buildings in New York City, but they're active across a lot of different platforms. I mean, they even bought the Paramount network and opening up things around that. Smaller groups, but not very small. Savannah, Fisher, different groups like that, and then all the big hotel players.
And Peter, who are the big players out on the West Coast where you're based?
Yeah, it's a little bit more fractured out there. Related plays a little bit out there. They have their West Coast office. Tishman, right, has a couple things going on up in San Francisco, although that's a really tough market right now. You see some on the office front, things like Kilroy. They're one of the bigger players out there. But we don't see this. The interesting thing is that you don't see as much of a critical mass under one developer out on the West Coast like you do sometimes in New York.
Interesting. Keith, what factors go into a developer's decision to add an F&B element to their project? But how do they think about it in the office when they're thinking about this new development? Who's thinking about it? How does it come to light? What are the steps that get it to the point where someone introduces the developer to the restaurant owner?
Yeah, I mean, it's at the highest end right now. It's in the executive committee meeting. So it's ownership, it's CEO, it's board members. And really what they're saying is immediately, how are we going to make this development viable? If we're taking over and fixing up an existing product, if we're making something new, how are we going to do it? So every single development that has a substantial presence, several 100,000 square feet at a minimum, knows that they need something in the F&B center to make that product viable. So they're thinking about it early on. The question is, if you get into it early enough that you get into the budget phase where you can actually control how they're spending money, not where it's too late and too far down the road where they're just stuck doing leases.
So once they make a decision, Peter, and they're like, because you've been in these meetings, that's what you did for a living. Once they make a decision, they say, okay, we're going to have an F&B outlet here. It's going to be a 180 seat restaurant.
Yep.
How do they decide what type of place? How do they decide who's going to go out there and find the restaurant owner? How does it come to market?
Sure. I mean, first you got to start with the building constituents itself. So who's going to be using that building on a day-to-day basis, right? If it's residences, who's your demographic that you're trying to sell apartments to or rent apartments to? If it's office, is it a tech office, right? Or is it, white shoe law firm? So you kind of got to start with that. Who are the people in the building itself that you want to appeal to, so that you can sell more apartments, lease more apartments, or lease more office space? But then you have to look at the surrounding community as well, because one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of times people can make on the development side is they just look at the building itself, and you're just appealing to the people in the building. You're completely missing the opportunity to potentially draw in people from surrounding buildings and surrounding community. And that's the key difference, right? That's the difference between having a restaurant in your building that does $800 a square foot, or having a restaurant in your building that does $1,500 a square foot. And we all want the second scenario, right? So it's really,
so once you parse that out, and once you take a look at the neighborhood and the building, who's deciding to take it out to market? Who's the one who's saying, we want to go high end, or we want to go fast casual, whatever the hell you decide? Who makes that decision, and how does it get to our clients?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, a lot of times it's going through someone like me or Keith, right? So we're helping, because again, a lot of times the landlords or the developers, that this is not their primary core business, right? They know how to build a building, they know how to build office or the specific asset, but now we're getting into minutia of, deciding, like, does this need a celebrity chef, or does this need a solid concept with a really strong operating group behind it? So it's the advisory service, right, that Keith and I provide, that we help them think through that and hopefully guide them to a decision that makes the most sense.
Got it. So that's what you and Keith do, right, Keith?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of fill in the gaps, and for a long time, the different developers had different experts on there. They have leasing experts that really know how to lease retail and that knew how to just lease spaces out to restaurants. But the way the world works now, they don't know how to operate restaurants. They've never operated them. They don't know who good operators are and how they work. So they bring people like Peter and I on, who've worked in restaurants, who've owned restaurants, who know how to deal with it, and then actually have our finger on the pulse of what's going on, who's going up, who's going down, those kinds of things. And that's, they rely on us for that information. And Peter and I both come up with a whole series of work that we have to do to prove out that these concepts are going to work in that space. A lot of financial underwriting, a lot of different kind of matrices that we put together, and we find a lot of questions and answers within the group to kind of identify who it is that belongs in what space.
Got it. Great. That's a great lead into our next slide. And so let's start talking about the deal. So now you guys are hired and you're out there looking for some owners. First of all, I'm running a nice place in Brooklyn or Manhattan. It's a 74-seater. It's gotten a lot of good press. I'm just living my life and, trying to think of the next move. How do I meet a developer, and how do I get them interested in my restaurant? Peter?
That's a tough one, right? Again, you can hire someone like me or Keith to help you do that. Again, I'm not making this as a sales pitch, but that is part of it. And just kind of getting yourself out there in more ways than maybe just your small community. And again, you can do that through social media and other things. It's trying to, even though you've got your 70-seat restaurant, is trying to get your name out there in more ways, and also just making sure that you appear to really have an organization kind of set up. That's the main thing, right? So even if you've got a small restaurant, you can still be organized. You can still have the appearance of kind of punching above your weight.
So Keith, when you introduce someone like I mentioned to a developer, what kind of advice are you giving them? What are they supposed to say to the developer? What are developers looking for from me, an operator who has one good restaurant?
Peter hit on it right there. I mean, first, they want to know that they have the ability to do more, and that it's not going to suffer, that they're not kind of chained to their stove and only being willing to take meetings in their space because they can't leave the space for fear that it's not going to run the way it's supposed to run. They need to have an org chart. They need to kind of understand like who they're going to draw from. And the org chart doesn't have to be up to the minute, up to date. It could be, I can draw these people, I can build them out. I think a big piece of it, you're saying, how do you meet these people? How do your clients meet people? How do other people like that go? I mean, it's the same way Peter and I get a lot of our business too. It's a lot of word of mouth, right? So, David, when you call Peter or I up and say, hey, I've got this group, I think you haven't thought about them. Why don't you give them a think? You've done that a couple of times, and it's, I think, paid off really big for your clients that have proven to you that they're ready to take the next step. And so sometimes we hear from different people. When we have a 12-person team, they're out in the world, they're eating, they're dining, they're going places. So I'd say that when you have somebody from one of our offices, from Peter's office or our office, kind of reaching out and saying, hey, do you mind if we stop by? It's not because we're looking to like cut the line on the reservations. It's because we've heard something good about your restaurant or your group. And we're not looking for, we're not asking you to accomplish meals and do things like that. I think what we're trying to say is we're looking for people that know how to run really good restaurants and putting out good products. We also want to see who's in your restaurant. We want to see the client mix that's in there, because that's really important too. Peter was saying, are we attracting tech people? Are we attracting lawyers? Who are we going after? So, if we're just going to a place and we see a bunch of great looking 20 and 25-year-olds that are having a good time, that's great for a very specific kind of restaurant thing that we're doing. But we also want to see people across different age platforms that are in there, that are eating, that are dining, that are having fun and doing things. And
okay, I got it. I got it. You want to see a cool place. You want to see who's hanging. You want to make sure that they know what they're doing and it's running well. Let's just say you do all that, Peter.
Yep.
And you decide you want to make an introduction.
Yep.
How do you make the intro? How many real estate bros are going to come to my restaurant? How much
Sure.
ass do I have to kiss? How do we get to a term sheet?
Yeah, and it's interesting. One thing I would say too, in this kind of the date negotiate is, I would compare it to regular dating too. If you're just coming out of a relationship and haven't dated for a while, probably don't start out with a 10. Maybe start out with like a 5 or a 6, and practice a little bit, right? So that's some advice that I like to give clients is, don't go for the gold, right? If you're new to this and you're trying to like figure out how to do this, you're going to want to practice a little bit.
How do you practice? What does that mean? How do you practice? What does that mean?
Honestly, it's part of having a conversation with someone like Keith or myself first, and we're going to take you through that thought process and ask you the questions and get you thinking about some things that maybe you haven't thought about before, because you haven't thought about growing your business. You have to go through that process and really think about it.
Like what, for example? What kinds of
like he said, like an org chart. Like a lot of people have the org chart in their mind, right? Maybe they don't. Maybe they haven't thought about what the positions are they need to add to their company to really grow it responsibly.
Okay.
It's things like that. So and then look, you have to decide what's the right fit, right? And Keith can talk to this as well. Just how you have very different types of chefs and operators and how they're wired and how they like to do things. It's the same thing on the real estate side. So it's kind of figuring out, right, who's the right match in terms of personality, and just style and kind of where you want to be going with things.
So what happens, Keith? They come to the restaurant, they say, hey, how you doing? I'm VP of whatever from Tishman. And then they have dinner a couple of times, and
well, not exactly. I think
they get to the point where they say, yeah, no, these guys are good. Let's give them a term sheet.
First thing what we do is we ask somebody to put a little deck together on their group and who they are and where they've been and what they do and kind of some ambitions and in terms of what they want to do, because before we even get to that point, we have to crack a couple different layers. So if they have a really good social media presence or a good online presence, that certainly helps, because people can look it up and see. So if it's being run professionally and organized, they're definitely going to check out all the social media. So if it's just a bunch of crazy stuff or whatever, then that's gonna define what it looks like. So you want to have a professional, well thought out plan. If you want to go after a management contract, you're going after real estate developers. They're not restaurant people. They don't understand hospitality necessarily. So what they do understand is what they think makes sense, and what they think is cool is like 4 degrees below whatever you think is cool.
So, actually cool. Yeah.
So you have to remember that. So if they check out your social media, they want to see cool stuff, but tempered. If it's crazy stuff, then that's only going to go a certain distance with certain people. If we get to the point, then we typically get people in for at least one meeting at the developer's office to get their temperature before the developer is willing to go. If it's something developers already really into, a lot of times they'll try not to tell us when they're going in because they don't want to rig the deck, but we almost always find out when they're going in, and almost everybody, and Peter's nodding, I mean,
Yeah.
almost everybody we do business with is Googling names and things like that and checking things. So, you want to be very careful about what goes on, and who's coming in. And quite frankly, during that process, think of it like you're under the review process. Think about like you're still in the review process while that's happening. Just a little.
So you're on your toes. You're giving them extra attention at the table. A lot of touches. Everything's cool. Peter,
One thing I'd like to add to this too that Keith mentioned is super important, because I've been through this a few times. When I was working at Related, all the executives insisted that the chef or operator always come in for the first meeting, and it's just one of those quirky things that they want to be the 800-pound gorilla. You have to come in and kiss the ring a little bit. Some chefs not really bristled at that, and it's like, wait a minute, I'm come in, I'll host you at my restaurant. Isn't that nicer? Don't think of it as an insulting thing, or it's just kind of how that process works. And as Keith said, a lot of times once that first meeting goes well, then they kind of loosen up, and all of a sudden they want to come in and kind of experience everything. But it's something that you'll see a lot of.
And what questions should we be asking a developer? I think all of us are a little sick of kissing landlords' asses and developers' asses. And for now, for example, we check out our landlords on behalf of our clients. We look to see if they're litigious, if they're bad to work with. What questions can we ask them at a meeting to see if we want to work with them?
I think that's really important. I think you want to ask questions. I think you want to know what meal periods you're going to be making food for, like what's really important, because if they don't have a good coffee shop in the building, they're going to expect that you're going to serve coffee, even if you've never done coffee before. If you're in an office building, the lunch, a 45-50 minute lunch, is going to be important, and early dinner and happy hour. So you have to understand the meal periods and what people are looking for. And I think you want to know as much demographics about who's in the building. Peter was saying, again, who they're targeting, who's in the building. Ask questions about who do you think are going to be your tenants. Ask questions about the neighborhood. These developers have tons of data, tons of information, and they're willing to give you all of it. And they're willing to work for you too. They typically have their own architecture and engineering firms. If you're willing to go into their offices and work with them, they'll put people to work with you. So
that's a nice bonus of working with developers. They will throw resources at you. Peter, what else should we be asking? Should we be asking about the DNA of the occupancy of the buildings?
Yeah, definitely. Like, again, what their goal is, right? So I think that's, especially, I'll just use office as an example, right? So right now, office is in trouble, right? They are having a hard time getting people just to come into the office, and they're having a hard time maintaining these big leases. So ask those important questions, because find out, like, hey, do you have a big lease turn that's going to happen in the next 2 years, right? If they are a 1 million square foot office building, and they're going to have 500,000 square feet of office vacant coming up in the next year or two, it's important that you are on the same page with them about that. Again, going back to the point about not just focused on the building, but the surrounding community. If all of a sudden they lose, right, that big tenant and that space stays vacant for a year, you've got to make sure that you've captured, right, all that surrounding community to fill that gap in the meantime. So those are the type of details that, and frankly, if they're not willing to have a really open conversation about things like that, that's when you just walk away, right? And because that's the partner. If you guys are in that type of level of conversation and trust, that's when things work really, really well. And back to say, hey, so you're going to lose that 500,000 square foot tenant. What's your A+ tenant that you want to nail, right? Is it a tech company, right? Is it the law? Like, what is it that you're looking for? And again, that helps to shape what's the concept that you bring and things like that. That's when you get the best success.
Thank you. Keith, we've seen a lot of building owners get into financial trouble over the last few years. How can we and our clients check the pulse of the financial health of a developer? Because when they sell a building or it goes into foreclosure, which we've seen, it really throws the management deal into the air, basically, and sometimes into the shredder.
Yeah, well, and you're making a good point. I mean, there's one project in particular that I know you're quite familiar with that we worked on with a division of Blackstone called Equity Office at 1740 Broadway, where John Fraser has Iris Restaurant over there. And then the building, when he first opened, it was pre-COVID, and they were getting offers for tons of money for the office upstairs. And they were kind of sitting back, deciding who they wanted their main tenants to be. Now the building is, nearly vacant. And John has decisions to make about what he wants for the future of that restaurant to be. And it's killing it. It was like on Esquire's list. The Esquire party was at that restaurant, and John's a fantastic operator, and he's running a great product. I mean, he's in an empty building that's full for lunch and dinner every day, which is amazing. But then he has to kind of understand, what his options are. And
What do you ask? What are the questions to ask the developer? I want to know how you're doing. Like, do I just look it up on Google? Do I look at their financials to see if they're having problems? Do I look at their stock price?
I think you're going to have some trouble there. Peter might be willing. What I can tell you is like the developers we work with, they're not going to open up the curtain. And quite frankly, they're going to be using single purpose entities to sign a lot of these deals that aren't highly, you're not going to find a lot of information about anyway. So
All
I
right.
think
So you just got to
ask the
take care
question
of
to
that
show-
in your deal. Your lawyer will hook you up in your management agreement in case they sell the building. We're going to move along because I knew this was going to happen. We're like halfway through and we're on the first slide.
Well,
Marrying
real
just
quickly,
means,
your lawyer's going to put some termination clauses in there and stuff.
yeah, we're going to talk about
Yeah.
everyone's favorite termination clauses. Marrying just means you get a term sheet, you negotiate a term sheet. A term sheet could take anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months. Really depends. Then you get married, which is signing a management agreement. And then many times you get divorced, but we're going to go through that. Alex, you want to take us to the next one? Let's talk about the benefits of a management deal from all sides. So Keith, the benefits for the owner. Which of these are the most important? There's a profit sharing benefit. There's the amenity benefit, which a lot of us think is the number one thing, and maybe we're wrong. There's marketing and press, which helps them sell whatever they're selling. And then there's ownership of IP. Which of those do you think is most important on their list?
So, it's really the most important thing is that they have care and control over the brand. And really that's, and it's going to be whatever it's there. At the end of the day, they're going to have final say over everything. So for sure, it's as an amenity, but it's only as an amenity if it's profitable. If it's bleeding all the time, it gets boring very quickly. We talk about it like a fish tank, about how pretty it is, and everybody likes looking at the pretty fish, and they start dying, and people don't like looking at the fish tank anymore. So even if it's a great restaurant that everybody loves, if it's just bleeding all the time, no matter what, it's going to get forgotten. The amenity value gets forgotten quickly. So it has to be a viable business too. But really understanding that the owner controls the entity as a whole. And if they say, hey, by the way, we need coffee or we need, something else. And at the end of the day, they have final say on almost everything, whether it's in their care or discretion, however it is, reasonable judgment. But you have to go into this understanding they own a big building, they're putting a ton of money up.
So they don't like to, Keith, they don't like to lose money. That everyone thinks that they put a lot of money up and it's an amenity and great, they sold some buildings, but a couple of years in, they're going to want to start seeing some return. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're going to want to be being paid rent, and they're going to want to be being paid back what goes on, and they're not going to forget about it. Now, there are one or two developers out there that are more forgiving about this stuff, and especially at the beginning, and especially if they have a lot to lease or a lot to sell based on that. So for the first couple of years, you're going to get some more leniency on it. But, at the end of the day, when you're constantly asking them to write checks, that's why we put a lot of time, and Peter knows this for sure, that we put a lot of time into these massive pre-opening budgets and showing like real ramp up periods. So whoever you're doing this with, you need to really show a pro forma that's really going to, that really is real. It's going to really show the struggle and the review process and all that at the beginning.
Absolutely. And ramp ups are huge. Peter, taking a look at the benefits for the manager, we have, obviously usually they don't have to come out of pocket.
Yeah.
No personal liability. They're not paying rent, or they're paying a percentage rent. And
Yep.
if there's a shortfall, the developer puts in the cash. Of these things, what do you think are the most important ones for the operators?
Yeah, look, it's the risk, right? You don't have lease risk. You're not signing guarantees. That's really the main thing. And a lot of times you've got kind of a guaranteed management fee potentially. So it's a little bit of a, low risk, high reward scenario. But again, you don't have the legal benefits of a lease. So back to Keith's point, like things start to go bad, pretty easy to lock the doors and not let you into the space, right? A lease gives you a much higher legal right, to physically occupy space and use the space. So just have to kind of balance those two things out.
And where does the staff, Peter, where do they usually work? Are they working are they hired by the owner or are they hired by the operator?
It depends. You can have both. A lot of times the owner, even though it's their restaurant, wants to have the manager have the employees sit under their entity, right, as a legal shield against some liabilities. But sometimes you will see that the employees are direct employees of the ownership entity, whatever the SPV that they set up for it.
I mean, that's interesting to us because we do not like to have the employees under us if possible. Obviously, it's a huge liability these days. Peter, is there typically some rent paid to the developer? And if so, how does that get paid?
A lot of times, we kind of call it's not really rent, right? Because it's literally coming out of one of their pockets and into the other. We just call it, an imputed rent sometimes, if it's a pure management agreement. Sometimes we've got a blend, right, where the developer still wants a lease in place, even though they're basically just leasing to themselves, because then they can roll that into like a building refi and actually get credit for that rent, even though they're just paying themselves. So it really depends on this scenario. Gotcha.
Let's go to the next slide, which are the drawbacks. The cons for the owner. Oftentimes there is no guaranteed rent. They do like that. There's no personal guarantees from the tenant, and it requires more involvement in operations than a typical landlord. Keith, of these, since now I've put you on the owner side of things, which of those things are the biggest drawbacks for the owner?
Well, and this is shifting a little too. So no guaranteed rent is true, but there is a percentage rent that typically accrues. So even if it's not capable of being paid at the time, it's going to accrue and it's going to go to the top of the waterfall at some point where it's going to get paid once the restaurant becomes profitable. The guarantees, and again, employees and guarantees, we've seen lately more guarantees in terms of you just can't quit. You can't leave or you'd be responsible for the cost of the build of the restaurant. So we can get into a little bit more of that later. But I think the one thing is it starts to get a little murky with the involvement of the owner in the restaurant and what that means and how much tolerance restaurateurs to have with how much tolerance and daily, weekly, or monthly oversight. So I think
let's stop there. I want to talk about that for a second because I've seen this to be a major pain point in a relationship between the manager and the owner, and that is how do they work together? Because, the last thing in the world a restaurant owner needs is for a real estate developer telling what to put on the menu or what color the menu should be. How do you deal with that?
I think
Who are you dealing with on the developer side?
You just said it. I mean, you want a really solid point of contact, and they're going to ask you as the operator, as the manager, for an org chart. And if I were you, I'd be asking for the same thing from them. I want to know who I'm reporting to daily, what their activities and roles are, or weekly or monthly, and who I'm going to be getting my feedback from moving forward. Because what we're seeing now, even with a couple of things that we put together lately, is that the manager is getting inundated by like 3 or 4 different people. Because the funny part about this is the landlords, the partners, the owners, however you want to term them, in this case, the owner, they talk about at the beginning about it's a restaurant, it's not really our business, it's not what, but
Yeah, but then they can't keep their mouths shut the whole time.
and at the end of the day, and we say this to every developer we start out with, it's going to be the best part of your day. Dealing with the restaurant, going into the restaurant, you're going to love it. And they end up loving it so much that they begin to start to get more involved. They want to.
It's the best part of their day and it's the worst part of the operator's day.
Yeah.
There's got to be a
Depends.
It can be it can be the opposite if you just know who it is that you're taking your advice from or that you're taking your cues from. So if you're getting cues from multiple different people, that's a problem, and you need to step in and say, hey, I'm being told I can do this by this person. And what we say is we always want to follow up when somebody stops by and wants to give you a little bit of advice. You want to follow that up with an email to everybody involved saying, hey, just so you know, this person said that we should really be looking at this, or said it's okay for me to do this. If you don't start putting things in writing, when it comes to this, you'll never, and I say that just
a nightmare. Sounds like you have to be a lawyer.
Well, I think what you have to do is be able to say, hey, but I spoke to this person, I told you all, and this is why we're going this way. If you want me to, if somebody else wants me to shift it, and I'm not saying this happens in every case.
Okay, all right. This is a major con. I'm going to call this a major con.
Yeah, and I would add
dealing with the other side all the time.
Yeah. One subtle thing to this too is huge difference if the owner is actually officed where the restaurant is, or if they're across the country, right? So this is a real, and you're just dealing with like a local asset manager, right? If you've got the owner of the company that has their office in that building, the heat put on you is turned on to high, if that makes sense, right? You've got a lot more laser focus
in your business every goddamn day.
Yeah, so you have to really be prepared for that. If you've got the big kahunas constantly coming down all the time, everyone's more nervous. It adds a different layer of complexity.
While I have you on the line here, let's talk about the cons of for the manager. So we just talked about ownership is in your business. That's number one from my point of view. Then you have these performance tests, which means that if you don't live up to your promise to make a certain amount of money, whether it's top line, bottom line, whatever, you can be axed. Another con for the manager is you don't keep 100% of the profits. You're sharing profits, but that's okay because you're taking your cut off the top.
Yeah, and I would say, look, I think that's no different than a lot of cases if you have an independent restaurant and you have investors, right? So you just have to basically, in some cases, just think about your developer landlord as your investor that you might have in an independent restaurant.
How common is it that the manager actually hits the number in the budget? Manager says, yeah, I'm going to do 10 million. And the developer says, we'll give you 2-year run up. How often do they actually hit it? What's the percentage?
You know what I see generally, on the top line, I'd say that percentage is maybe around 70%. It's definitely over 50%. Where I see it not hitting as much is in bottom line. So I think a lot, and Keith, you should weigh in on this one too.
Yeah, I want to ask, I
I'm
want to
just
hear what you
curious.
have to say too. What do you think about that?
With Peter, and I'll say, a lot of it comes down to how much we can prep ownership for what the real numbers are supposed to be, right? So, I feel really good about top line. I think we know. I think Peter and I and David, any of us, and probably everybody on this line can walk into any restaurant and say, generally speaking, what we think it should do in business within 10% or 15% based on where it is and size and everything else. I think the bottom line, it's really important that these pro formas and that what you're signing off on seems at least logical, because sometimes what we say is there's like three different performers. There's one that's super aggressive, and that's for bank and lenders and things like that, depending on who you're dealing with. There's one that goes into the agreement, which should be very conservative, and then there's one to live by. So we want to really talk about what the one is to live by, but we want the one to go in the agreement to be a little bit more conservative so that we can hit those without worrying about getting kicked off on some KPI or metric. So you want to be careful about that. And I think you want to keep pushing to get those numbers that are going to be attached to an agreement lower. And then, always exceed everyone's expectation and try to get for it. I think we've done better, but Peter's, it's tricky. If someone wants something that's in the agreement that has to be, you know, a little elevated and going through, as long as everybody in the room is having those conversations and really knows what it is, you know, you can live with it.
So the key there is to make sure that you spend a lot of time on the budget and that you're very, very realistic about the numbers, and don't just say yes to get the gig to make the developer happy, because you'll end up paying for it later. Correct?
100%. Yeah.
Great.
And
Next
100%.
And David,
Let's go.
just real quick, just because a lot of this is going to be done even after the agreement signed.
I got you. Next
Yeah.
slide, please. Development fee. I love a development fee. It's amazing how many deals come across my desk that don't have them in them, and I always put them in. A development fee is for the work you do before you open. You're putting a menu together, you're testing. It's a ton of time. You're putting budgets together. And a lot of developers will ask you to just do that on the arm because you're getting such a great deal from them. But that's not how we do it in the industry. We always negotiate for your time, and we put a value on that, anywhere from $50,000 to $500,000. Really depends on 500 being very, very top, depending on what you're doing. So let's talk about the owner-friendly development fee. And Peter, I'll switch you over to the owner side.
Sure.
Obviously, the lower the better, the better.
Yeah.
They want to minimize the upfront payment to hedge their bet. And sometimes they like to condition the payments on deliverables. What's the most owner-friendly of those things, and how do they look at development fees in general?
Yeah, or they'll sometimes even ask you to like roll in some of your management fee, right? So that they can even grab even more from that. But it's like you said, they want to have it be zero. And this is the other one. They may even ask that you're putting in some of the pre-opening costs, right? So, oh, you take care of pre-opening payroll costs and like that you've got to walk away. Like when you start to get into a conversation, that can just kind of really snowball into a scenario where you're just outlaying a lot of time and effort, opportunity cost, and then money. And again, you don't own the business. So you got to be super careful about that, because you can even get into a scenario where you've put all that time in, you've started to spend some money, and a couple of months into it, they just like, you know what, this just isn't working, and they pull the plug, right? And now you're out a lot of time and money. And so be very, very careful about getting into a scenario like that.
Well, most owners in your experience, will they pay a development fee?
If they're an educated developer, they're used to this type of deal structure, they absolutely will, especially in the hotel world. That's much more common, that they understand that you're putting together a concept for them. The rub to that is, you got to be a little bit careful about this, is sometimes they will try, if the higher the development fee because you're creating a new concept for them, then they may start to ask that they have co-ownership of the IP, or even worse, 100% ownership of the IP. Again, in my view, for the chef, that should be a deal breaker. That IP.
We're going to talk about the IP.
Yeah. So, but it's very much related to this, because you will see this, a lot of pushback. If you start to push to get a development fee, they're going to ask for more of the IP. So you got to be very careful about that.
That's a very good point. Keith, do you see the range from 50 to 500? Am I right here? And where's the sweet spot?
Yeah, I mean, we don't usually see it that low, we don't usually see much below 100, unless it's a really quick job. It's really, we talk about time. And then what we also do is, if we're on the manager side, we sometimes even ask for like some kind of project manager budget, in addition to maybe even go on the pre-opening budget that can be just dedicated to that, of another like $5,000 a month or whatever. So they can have a dedicated person that's a specialist and kind of running that project for them, brought in. But it depends. It all depends on how far out the project is and how many layers it is. Is it a multi-million square foot building that's going to take 18 months to get through, construction?
So you determine it based on how much time it's going to take.
It's time. It's really time. And then what kind of non-compete is circled around it too. So if there's a big
how important is it that let's say the fame of the restaurateur, for example, if Thomas Keller is coming into the Time Warner Center versus someone going into Rock Center, who maybe has one restaurant, the development fees are going to be very different.
Yeah.
Very different. Yeah,
How-
very,
Is
very,
that,
very
is that a
different.
major factor?
Although Peter, I don't know if Thomas Keller's gotten any more managers, any more development fees in New York after the TAC room, right?
Yeah, no, but it's a good
Yeah.
question. It's a huge factor in what this number ends up being.
Sure.
If you're, a smaller organization, right, it's harder for you to really demand this, because they also view it as an opportunity cost, right? And so if you're a big operator and you've got a lot of things, you taking people offline, right, to do a new concept, you can demand some more money for that.
If you're in high demand, as it is, you're the one that everybody wants. You're the prettiest girl at the dance. You're gonna get the top of the scale here.
Okay, let's move to the next one. So this is where we make our money. This is where the operator takes home a check. This is why I like my clients to have these kinds of things in their portfolios, because there's a certain guaranteed money that you get to take home every single month. So a base fee is typically a percentage of the gross. Is that right, guys? Is there any other way
Yes.
to talk about a base fee, or is it always a percentage of gross? Always a percentage?
No, always percentage. Yeah.
We've seen the number from 4 to 7. Peter, how do you, and it's a big difference.
Yeah.
I mean, a deal
Huge.
at 4 versus a deal at 7 is
Yep.
huge. If you're
Yep.
doing 10 million a year, do the math.
Yep.
So how do you negotiate this? How is it determined? Is there room for negotiation?
Yeah, there's always room for negotiation, and there are a couple of big things that go into it. One is this a proven concept that they know is going to drive a lot of traffic and get a lot of attention? Now you're at the higher end of the spectrum, right? Is this something new? Maybe they're taking a chance on you, more uncertainty, right? You're going to be on the lower end of the spectrum. So I think that's the kind of the key thing that goes into it. Another thing in this is, and I see it done both ways, is do you also have corporate overhead fees? Do you have some corporate overhead that you have to allocate because of different positions? I generally like to stay away from that, because then all of a sudden it's like, well, we're doing a 4% fee, but then we've got a 1% for this and a 1%, and then on the owner side, the landlord side, they get a little bit annoyed by that. It just feels like, a creep, a fee creep. Wait a minute, I thought we were at 4 and now we're at 6. I tell clients, just go for the percentage that makes sense for you as an overall percentage. You don't have a bunch of little
number. Keith, what are your feelings on base fee and these percents and how to approach it?
Yeah, I mean, and I also think it depends on what the value of the product is. So we're doing like a 1,900 room hotel in Times Square that could have 70 to 100 million in F&B. You're not going to get a 6 or 7%.
Yeah,
they're not going to do that. They're going to want you to get profitable. They're going to want you to take a big piece of the bottom line. But if it's a 10 to $15 million, gross, we want to typically try to make the base around 5%. It depends on different markets you're into and the brands that you're associated with, whether you're associated with a Ritz or a Moxie. You're going to be looking at different values in terms of what those things look like, and you can always grab more of an incentive fee. You can always shoot for more. If you're willing to take more profit, then you can really lever this. If you're to say, okay, I'll take 4% of the gross, but then I want 70% of the profit or 60%. So if you really feel like you're going to have a very profitable restaurant, you do the numbers. And we've seen a couple of people do this lately that knew they were going to put, and they really killed it with it by because the ownership wants to see you de-risk them, which means because they're going to have to pay. This is the first 4 to 7 cents out of every dollar paid, not the last. So as a result, if you're going to take the risk away from them, you can get a whole lot more later.
It's all about risk for the money, guys.
Yeah.
Here's a question. What's the difference in a base fee? Do you see it changing on the percent if it's a lower revenue cocktail lounge and or cafe versus a full service restaurant that has higher revenue? Does that come into play when you're talking about a base fee?
What we're seeing now, and Peter, you're probably seeing this too, is minimum base. So if it's a small cocktail bar, there has to be a minimum. Like I would say, you're not going to do anything for less than $200,000.
Yeah.
So it's got to be a minimum base that you're going to get a check for 1/12 of it on the first of every month, and then you can true up, on the 15th of the following month. So for me, there's no point of doing any of these deals if you don't have whatever the minimum number is coming into your group that makes it worth your time and energy to do it. So,
Yeah.
I
But I think that, I think the question is, and this you'll see a lot, a lot of times they view a cocktail bar as not having as much effort on the management side. So they do expect a lower base fee than if you've got a full service restaurant, which they know takes a lot more effort to put that together. So yes, generally cocktail bar, probably a lower percentage versus a full service restaurant in my experience.
Interesting. And the monthly minimum is important. We always try to get those into the agreements where at least you're going to get a minimum amount for your time and effort. How do developers feel about that, Peter? Are they cool with it?
Well, they always hate it, but they always agree to it.
Okay.
I shouldn't say always. 90% of the time they end up agreeing to it. And again, if you've got someone on the landlord side really, really pushing back against that, you got to be very careful.
Alex, let's go to the next slide, please. Let's talk about incentive fees. That's just what it says it is. It's an incentive for you to do well. It's an incentive for you to make money. For me, the developer, if you make us money, we'll give you money. That's just how they work. So there's owner-friendly incentive fees. Keith, you want to talk about what an owner-friendly incentive fee is?
Yeah, I mean, an owner friendly is the first thing that they take, incentive meaning profit or EBITDA, that they take 100% of that until any owner advances, meaning any shortfalls are paid back. And then after that, they might even take up to 100% of that to pay back whatever the agreed upon build out pre-opening budgets and all that are to pay back. And then after that, what split goes in terms of ownership going to the manager and what the owner gets to keep in terms of profit. And, we are always driving ownership to make it more manager friendly here. We want the manager, having the ability to make money on profit. The last thing you really want is a manager realizing that they can just have a $10,000 buyout and lose money or be profit neutral on it and still get paid their top line fee, and not because they're not going to share in the profitability. Why shouldn't they tighten up? Why shouldn't they do that? So,
and what do people have to look out for in these owner friendly incentive fee clauses? Because my concern is always the amount of money they're going to spend on the project is so much that it's going to take us 10 years for them to get paid back, and we're never going to get a penny of incentive fee.
well,
The worst thing is interest. That I've seen you will get buried. If you allow some type of interest or pref on that, you're never going to get out from under it. That's the main thing that you have to avoid.
Tell me what that would look like, Peter. What's the best incentive fee structure for an operator?
Yeah, you know what I think it's the 80, what you're describing is 80-20. As Keith said, the main thing is you've always got to be incentivized from day one. Don't ever go into a deal where there's no incentive on the bottom line. It just changes your mindset in terms of how you view the operation. So you always need to start with maybe even if it's 10%, 10 to 20% to start, and then some type of promote structure. And I usually like to have it based on timing. And they get this, right? They're IRR driven, they're time driven in terms of getting their capital back. Have it tiered so that you say that, hey, look, if I get all of your money back you invested in this restaurant in 4 years, I get to have 80% of the profits. Surprisingly, they'll actually agree to it a lot. And then if it takes me 5 to 6 years, then I only get 60%. If it takes me over 7 years, I only get 40%. Those types of, if you're willing to do that type of tier, they get really excited by it, I find. And a lot of times, again, if like he said earlier, if you're going to hit it out of the park, maybe you even take a lower base fee on that deal, but you have this tiered structure on the bottom line where you can really make a lot of money.
Okay, so we're playing around with base, we're playing around with incentive. Yeah. That's some pretty cutting edge ideas you got there, Peter. I like it. Let's move on to the next slide. Let's talk about some bonuses that we like to build into these agreements, and tell me how much they're worth and how often. This will be a speed round, and how often owners will allow them. Durst, you're up first. One or more Michelin stars, how much are they worth and how often?
Honestly, man, I don't like any of it. I don't want any of these because I also don't want a health department put on there then, you know what I mean? Where then if you start in with this, then they're going to start in on you and it's not worth it. 50 grand, 100 grand. I mean, at the end of the day, you're just, it's not worth I wouldn't.
You're far right on this. I like it. Are you
Yeah,
on the left, Peter, or where are you on this?
No, I'm pretty much with Keith on this. These are not worth falling on your swords to get these into agreement. You look, if you've got someone, an owner that loves the idea of having a Michelin star, then maybe they're going to agree to this and it's an easy conversation. Great. But these are not ones to argue over. That's for sure. Way more important to focus on base fee and incentive fee.
I got to respect you both. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about how long of a term we should be asking for. Mr. Durst?
Yeah, again, I think this depends on the capital outlay, and I think it depends on the building. I mean, 10 is kind of standard. We kind of switched from 10 to 12 just to give you a little bit more time to deal with the ramp, so you get the 10 full, and then you've got KPIs in there, and you could put certain kind of metrics that you get an automatic renewal in. Usually, we don't get a ton of fighting for that, but what I will tell you is you're going to end up with an RNet, like a line on the P&L where they're going to start sifting off money to do the refresh. So if you're going to want a very long-term deal, you should expect like 1% top line, 1.5% of top line getting put into a forced savings account. So they have enough money every 6, 7 years to go in there and use that money.
They're taking some money off the top. They're putting it in a bank account.
Yes.
They can redo the FF&E or whatever, refresh the whole place.
Yeah.
That
And
money,
if you have a long-term lease, you're okay with it, or long-term deal, you're okay with it. If you don't, probably not okay with it.
Peter, what do you think about these, a term? What's a good term for an operator?
Yeah, I'm with Keith. It's that 10 years is kind of standard. If you're a super established concept with good history, you can push for the 15 and you may get it. Most landlords are going to push back against that and kind of stick with the 10. I like to at least get, really push for two 5-year options, right? If 10 with 2 5 options is kind of what I try and push for.
Let's go to the next slide. Thanks, guys. Let's talk about termination. This is huge. This is the part we negotiate as lawyers the heaviest, and that is what bad things do you have to do to get fired from this gig? And it's all about money. It's always about money. Let's talk about, Peter, what is the ideal performance test for a manager? When we talk about performance test, what we mean is that you as an operator have to hit a certain dollar amount in gross, sometimes a certain dollar amount in net. Lay it out for us, how it works and what to look out for.
Yeah, for the most manager friendly, what you want is that tied to your ongoing budgets, right? That you're going to sit down and go and create every year versus the original pro forma, right? Pro forma is a pro forma, right? It's a lot of guesswork that goes into it, even if you put a lot of effort into it. So being tied to something before you've even opened, that's the most dangerous, right? So ideally you want it tied to the budgets you're going to be doing going forward. And again, that kind of percentage, right? I see it.
So that budget process going forward is so important that you have to really how often are you going through that budget process with ownership, and how long does that take?
Yeah, so generally it's you've got your annual budget. You're going to start that if it's a fiscal year in January. You're going to start that process probably in October, right? It's going to be a back and forth of 3 months, so that when you start that new year, you've got a budget in place. And there are all kinds of provisions in the agreement that if you can agree on a budget, right, you're taking the previous year's budget with a CPI increase, and so you still can operate, right, in lieu of not having a budget. There's always arbitration and other things in there. But I think that's the important thing. The other thing is to always have some type of metrics in there. Act of God, building occupancy, other things that are out of your control that would automatically kind of reduce that budget down as it relates to this performance test. So those are, I think, super important to include.
Keith, you got anything to add to that?
I mean, just, I know we're up against it here. I would just say that termination for convenience or at will is something that you have to be very careful with. Giving anybody the right to terminate you because they're selling the building or something like that. And you want that to be a very hefty fee in there, and so not punitive, but the only time we've ever seen it come in is typically when people are selling the building. And if that's the case, everybody, even if you have a successful restaurant, people just want people out. So that should be a real number.
Yeah, and you're always going to see that in a hotel deal. That's just so don't get scared by that. If you see that in a hotel deal, it will absolutely 100% have to be there. To Keith's point, just make sure that it's something that's relatively painful. And look, you can get a major payout, right? If somebody's going to come in and spend $100 million buying a hotel, and you've got $1 million termination fee, you'd be surprised how quickly they can just like fold that into the overall building sale, and it can be a great payday for you.
Yeah, we've seen it happen. Big paydays. It's been great. Moving on to the next one. Be wary of, we talked about budgets. Everything's about the budget. You got to have consent. You got to be involved in the budget. You got to have somebody on your team who knows what they're talking about when you are putting the budget together with the owner. It's absolutely essential. Non-competes are something that we negotiate heavily and that owners are going to want to burden you with. They don't want you opening up a similar concept in the neighborhood. That's for sure. Then they may try to expand it to the city. They may try to expand it to the coast or to the whole United States. So non-competes are very, very carefully worded and heavily negotiated. Anything you guys want to say about non-competes?
Yeah, I would say this, that the major counter argument that you have to non-compete is again, if you're putting together the right organization structure with the right talent, the more critical mass you have in one market and kind of going on, the more talent that you can put into that, and you can get better. Again, you don't want to have the exact same concept, block away, but that's where you can really kind of counter this argument and say, look, you want me to go to Boston to operate one restaurant? How much emphasis am I going to put on that? If I can do 3 restaurants up there, guess what? I'm going to put more talent there, and you'll get a better outcome.
Makes sense. Key person clauses. You're the chef. We want you there 20 days a month. It's just awful.
Yeah.
We always say,
we don't even know developers that are going to be that crazy anymore. That's where the org chart comes in. I've got a chef de cuisine. I have a corporate chef. These people, they're going to be training. We're going to be doing this. Yeah, we have to be by. We don't ever let anybody put dates in, the number of dates, reasonable amount of time to functional.
Alex, can you move to the next one? We're going to talk about jargon. This is also going to be speed round. And then we're going to take questions. So think about your questions. If you have any, start sending them to me in the chat box. Keith,
Yeah.
I got these from you sent me something that had all these terms on it. So let's start with you. TI, TIA, and TA.
Yeah, that's a tenant allowance or tenant improvement allowance. And basically, even in a management deal, you should expect a couple things. One, the owner developer to bring all the services to your space that you don't have to pay for. And 2, for a percentage of the total build to be an improvement allowance and not to be paid back. So you want to obviously get as much as you can. And pref kind of comes into this too. So you want to get as much as you can, but you're going to be negotiating this well before you're even going to know what these numbers are. So you want to try to negotiate a max on this, and then you want to negotiate a percentage of the total that's going to try to get to a number that you're going to be satisfied with that shows that you're getting some amount of a discount.
Peter, what's a pref?
Yeah, that's what I was saying before. It's kind of the interest, right, that would accrue on the capital account. So to Keith's point, if you've got a total, let's just use the numbers, you've got a total build out of $10 million. Let's say in a normal lease situation, the landlord would spend $2 million in tenant allowance to bring in a lease. You should expect them to take that same $2 million and deduct that right from the $10 million total budget. Now you're left with $8 million in capital that they're spending in addition to the TA. The pref is an interest rate put on that $8 million in this example that's constantly accruing. And my point earlier, do not
never get out of that.
It'll bury you.
Just quickly, I'll say this, Peter, we've seen a lot of like one-time prefs put on lately.
That totally works.
Yeah,
Yep.
which
Yep.
10, yeah, like a 10% one-time fee, but yeah, you get a compounded number in there. Just
Compounded, you're done. You'll
the
you'll
worst
never
credit
get
card
out from under
you've
it.
ever
Yeah.
had. Yeah, it's
Okay,
just the
okay,
worst.
enough of press. What's a shortfall, Keith?
That's when you're operating and you're running out of, you don't have enough money to pay all your bills, and you have to go to the landlord and ask, or you have to go to the owner and the developer to ask for money. That money's going to get given to you. There could be a pref on that money too. And you want to make sure it's not compounded again, and then you have to pay that back. It goes into an owner advance column that then goes to the top of the waterfall, meaning it goes back to get paid.
Anytime the owner gives you money, they're gonna take it back.
They want it back.
Every single time.
100%.
What's a financial waterfall, Peter?
Yeah, so that's kind of basically think about it in terms of the priority of how money's coming out of the business, where it's going to go. So first, you may have the top of the waterfall, maybe your management fee, and the next thing may be your rent, and then the next thing after that is down to the bottom line in terms of splits. As Keith said, a shortfall generally is the first priority next, and that's going to go to pay any money coming out is going to go to pay back the shortfall. Then the money is going to that split that we talked about earlier. Maybe it's an 80-20, maybe it's a 70-30 split. 70 generally going to the owner and then 30 to you. And then maybe after you paid all the capital back, you get your promote, and maybe you're 30%. In the example I gave, maybe now you're at 50%.
Okay, that's too many percentages for me. What's payback?
It's a lot, I know.
What's payback, Keith?
Yeah, I mean, that's just you're all on the same line there. The payback's the amount that you're going to agree on to pay back to get the restaurant open.
Okay, owner's discretion, Peter?
I'm not sure what that refers to.
Let me answer that. I put that in there, Peter. And it basically, all it says, anytime there's something up to owner's discretion or owner's reasonable discretion, it means owner has final say. So it's just a fact. If it's whether it's reasonable or unreasonable, doesn't really matter. It's theirs. They have final say.
All right, Keith, stick with us on critical path. What's that?
So what we like, the critical path is working backward from an opening date and everything that you have to do to get open. That's the critical path. From the day you get involved in this, they're going to say, okay, you're going to be open in 18 months. You're going to put that on the calendar. And when you start missing things, then that date starts getting pushed, and then trouble starts from there.
Peter, what's percentage rent?
Yeah, so percentage rent is rent paid based on the sales revenue that you're doing versus a base rent. And the break point is generally set. So let's say you've got a break point that's $10 million and a percent rent factor that's 6%. Any revenue that you do over that $10 million break point, you're going to put 6% of that is going to go to the landlord as rent.
And okay, did you just talk about break points?
Yeah.
Okay, good. That's it. That is that's our webinar. You guys were unbelievable. That was quick. That was a lot of information in very, very little time. And I found it incredibly exciting. I'm not surprised based on who you guys are. Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
Let's see if anybody has any questions. Sometimes, people take a second to write them out. So we like to hang around for just a couple of minutes and see if anybody's got anything they want to ask us. Anybody got any questions? My voice gets so dry after talking for an hour straight, even though you guys talked so much. This is going to be, this is being taped, and we will put it up on our website. So if you want to watch it again and again and again, you may.
A good way to put yourself to sleep at night.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions come in, which either means that the chat box isn't working or that we have covered everything so thoroughly that nobody needs to ask us anything. So I'm going to thank you guys again. Keith Durst, Peter Peterson. Well, someone's got a question. They put a hold on it. So I'm waiting. That's okay. Go ahead, Tracy. We're waiting to hear your question.
Maybe just let her voice it, David.
I have no ability to do that.
I could tell you about my tech problem in our new conference room last week that set me into a tailspin. 20 people and then forced to sit around with laptops open with the speaker in the middle instead of
Always happens.
all the technology in the world surrounding you.
Here's this question. Sorry if I missed this earlier. Is it still common for hotel deals to be 10 to 20% gross to the chef?
Never.
Oh,
I've never-
No,
The number's now 4 to 6 usually is the sweet
Yeah.
spot.
Yeah.
Here's another question. Breakfast.
You know what? Actually, David, maybe she's thinking like a Vegas licensing fee of 10%. You know, was that maybe 10 years ago, they were still doing 10% on licensing?
yeah, you're not seeing that anymore.
Yeah, I'm not seeing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got a question about breakfast. Everybody's favorite topic. I know that restaurateurs generally hate it, but hotels often need it. What are the creative ways to handle this? Do hotels ever subsidize breakfast service?
100%. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, what we see a lot is that you have a formula that basically takes a lot of that risk away from you. And so that that revenue and the cost, right? Sometimes it's even a loss leader where you're losing money, does not go into calculating the bottom line incentive fee that you're getting.
Separate P&L. You can run a whole separate P&L off of it to keep it from hurting you.
Okay.
Very common now.
But you can do that in an office too. It doesn't have to be a hotel deal. It can be in any deal. Breakfast can be tough.
I'm going to thank you guys again. Keith Durst, Peter Peterson, the Tupac and the Biggie, the East Coast, West Coast
There we go.
luminaries.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us. It was a great webinar, and we'll see you again soon.
You will.
Thanks.
Bye.